what type of tool this is? Or what sizes of wire these are? Or even what the names of these gemstones are and what kind of properties they have? Well, if you're like me, part of a microculture of jewelry makers and jewelers, then you'd know. Now, you might be wondering, what makes jewelers and jewelry makers a microculture in the United States? Well, we have certain values and characteristics that we have that distinguish us from the macroculture. For example, jewelers and jewelry makers tend to have a symbiotic or harmonic relationship with nature. We see nature as beautiful, something to be appreciated, and its creations as holding beauty and epitomizing nature, such as gemstones and the metals that we extract from the earth. We see beauty in them, and we combine them to create beautiful objects that others can appreciate. Whereas the macroculture tends to view nature as something that should be subjugated, that humans are dominant and should dominate nature. Another value that jewelers, jewelry makers have that makes us a microculture and differentiates us from the macroculture is that we value very fine detail, artistic creativity. For example, this is a pendant that I made. As you can see, as long as the camera focuses, as you can see, there's a lot of fine detail in this necklace, such as the roots of the trees and the way that I bent the metal to kind of hold the gems in place. Other jewelers, jewelry makers would see that detail and they would understand and appreciate the amount of work that went into it, as well as the design aspect of how I bent the metal to resemble the shape of a snowflake. The macroculture might not necessarily understand how much time and effort went into doing something like that. They could appreciate the beauty, but they might not necessarily appreciate the craftsmanship. And they might not understand how much time went into thinking, well, how can I make this design function? Something else that makes jewelers and jewelry makers a microculture in the U.S. is our set of behaviors and patterns of communication that we utilize. For example, this plier that I showed you is a type of plier known as a bail-making plier. And by bail, I don't mean bail of hay or bail somebody out of jail. I mean the part of a pendant that connects the pendant itself to either a chain or a rope to create a necklace. There are other pliers such as, let's see here, chain nose plier. This is used for making sharp angles. There is the round nose plier, which is used for making round decorative aspects or other bails. And then there is the bent chain nose plier, excuse me. This is used to get into very small spaces that you might not necessarily be able to reach with other pliers without marring your design. We also use different terms for types of metal wire and thickness. For example, there are different metals. There's argentium, sterling silver, and fine silver. And all three of those are different. Even though they all have silver in them, argentium sterling silver contains more germanium, which means it is more tarnish resistant than sterling silver, which is 92.5% silver with some copper to make an alloy. And fine silver is 99.9% silver, which means it tarnishes very quickly and it's also quite soft and flexible. So if you wanted to use it in a project that might need to be durable, it might not be a good idea to use it. There are also different gauges of wire that jewelers and jewelry makers use that the populace might not understand. Macroculture, I mean. For example, this thicker wire right here is known as an 18 gauge wire. This thinner wire right here is a 24 gauge. Wire gauges go from 2, which is extremely thick, to 34, which is very thin, almost thread-like in thinness. And if worked too much, will become brittle and break. There are also different hardnesses to metal. For example, this copper wire right here, see how easily I bend it? That is known as dead soft, meaning the wire is soft and supple. I can bend it easily with like just my bare hands. Half hard wire is a bit more tempered, meaning that it's more difficult to work with your bare hands. And when working with tempered wire, you're probably going to want to use a bunch of tools. Other knowledge or terminology that differentiates jewelers, jewelry makers from the macroculture, thus making us a microculture, is our knowledge of not only the names of gemstones, but their properties, both metaphysical and physical. For example, some of you might not know that this is charoite. This gorgeous chatoyant gem is labradorite. And this gem right here, if you can kind of see it, is udilite or udilite. I'm not familiar with the metaphysical properties offhand, but I do know that this stone over here, this little guy, is known as petersite, and it's called the Tempest Stone because if you look at it, focus camera, do it. It almost looks like a stormy sky or a stormy sea. And I believe it's supposed to have something to do with calming energies. Turbulent ones, at least. Now, jewelers, jewelry makers would know the difference between these name-wise and appearance, and metaphysical, but also physical, and by that I mean hardness. And by hardness, I mean its ability to be scratched by other gemstones or to scratch other gemstones. This is known as the Mohs scale of hardness. For example, diamonds have a Mohs scale rating of 10, meaning that they are the hardest gemstone known to man, and that they can scratch other gemstones but not be scratched by gemstones themselves. For an example of a low Mohs scale rating gemstone is actually over here. These light blue beads up top, those are known as hemimorphite. They have a very low Mohs scale rating, so they can easily be scratched by other gemstones or even other metals. And they might be prone to being damaged in solutions. For example, say I wanted to make this copper that makes this necklace a bit darker. I'd put it in a patina solution known as liver of sulfur. If I did that, the hemimorphite would be adversely affected by the solution and possibly discolor or even like start breaking, being damaged. Something else that jewelers, jewelry makers kind of need to know or do know that differentiates from the macroculture is a little bit of chemistry. I kind of touched the subject when I was talking about the patina solution. We need to know how to utilize some of the chemical solutions that we use. For example, to use liver of sulfur, you need to dissolve the solution in lukewarm water But you do not want to use boiling water, because if you combine boiling water with liver of sulfur, you will create sulfur dioxide, which is an extremely toxic gas that can kill you. The general populace might not know this, but as jewelry makers and jewelers use these materials, we do. We also have different ways of describing the shapes of gemstones. For example, these gemstones have a nice flat back. It's not necessarily polished, it can be. And they're slightly domed. This is what's known as a cabochon. This is utilized in making pendants, like this. Other gemstones come in different shapes. These rounder beads are just, well, they're beads, but they're round beads. These right here, they're more 3D, and they're very faceted, but their shape looks like an onion, so they're called onion briolets. And then these little gemstone chips that make up the leaves of the tree are simply known as chips. So gemstones, the same gemstone, can come in a number of shapes and sizes. What else? Yes. The prevalence of the microculture in the U.S. There aren't actually a lot of jewelers and jewelry makers in the United States, at least that are recorded by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. About 27,000 people are in the industry or part of the microculture that is counted. Those are employed by various companies throughout the country. And most of the jewelers, jewelry makers are concentrated in metropolitan areas or urban areas. Big cities with a lot of disposable income, like New York and LA. Also, probably due to a higher population percentage, the ethnic group that is most predominant in the microculture of jewelry making is white, Caucasian, followed by Asian. And then, interestingly enough, it's followed by an unknown ethnic group, which I find quite strange. I couldn't find any good statistical data with regards to the global percentage of my microculture, but I do know that India especially is a very big epicenter of jewel manufacturing or gemstone production, like the mining and the shaping and polishing of gemstones. With regards to interesting facts about my microculture, one of the things that I found out in my research is that the average age of people involved in my microculture, or part of it, is about 45, which makes me a statistical outlier because I'm only in my mid-20s. Another interesting fact that I found while doing my research was that men tend to be more involved in the manufacturing aspect of jewelry making, whereas women tend to be the highest consumers of jewelry. However, when I'm on Etsy and I'm just browsing the handmade jewelry selection, I noticed that a lot of the shops or shop owners are women. So, considering that the statistics only count majorly employed people and not self-employed jewelry makers, I think if they did include the self-employed, the statistics would be a lot different. A third interesting fact that I found while doing my research was that the average annual income of jewelry makers or jewelers was not that bad, about $42,000, which isn't the greatest, but it's more than I'm making right now, you know. Also, when I was doing my research, I found that the oldest known piece of jewelry that was made by man is actually 40,000 years old. I thought the Egyptians were some of the oldest civilizations, and maybe even Mesopotamia, but 40,000 goes way back, and I was really surprised that humans have been creating jewelry for that long, basically since we've been able to create civilizations. So that means that the microculture that I'm part of has been with humanity for a long time. So, you know, that's a great legacy to be a part of. And the last information I stumbled across, I found very interesting, was that in the U.S., people of Asian ethnicity have the highest amount of disposable income. And disposable income is usually spent on jewelry, at least by Caucasians or white people. But interestingly enough, even though people of Asian ethnicity have the most disposable income, they do not spend it on jewelry. And this makes me wonder if it's because their culture tends to be less materialistic than American culture. But also, jewelry tends to be a very high context thing, and a lot of Asian cultures are very high context. So that made me wonder why there was such a disparity. You know, you would think that being that jewelry is so high context, and that is something that Asian cultures value, they would be part of it. But interestingly, they're not. So I'm wondering what you guys think about that. Let me know. In conclusion, the microculture of jewelry and jewelry makers is small but close-knit. It tends to be a bit more collectivist, where everybody views themselves as mostly equal, with little characteristics that distinguish them from each other. But they tend to support each other, both financially and creatively. And I am very proud to be part of something that has been part of human history for a very long time.